When I left for vacation a few weeks ago, I promised you and I promised myself to stay off the grid for some time. I did fairly well at that. For quite a number of days, I managed to avoid both email and Facebook. Every now and then, I was tempted to check, but for the most part, I did well. I made a promise that I was going to stay away from church for a few weeks. I discovered one problem. You don't go to Europe if you're trying to stay away from churches. Seemingly every single day, there was yet another church to explore. And after a while, you've done it, a church becomes a church becomes a church. So I did not get a break from church. Funny is, we really never get a break from being a Christian. To remind you of those questions the priest ask at every baptism, the vows you make, repeat at every baptism, we don't get a vacation from being a Christian, from being a disciple of Jesus. However, there are people who sit in these first 4 or 5 pews here that are taking a vacation from church. So maybe I should direct my words to the empty pews here. It's really natural, normal, tempting to come here on a Sunday morning to escape the world. God knows there's enough violence and bad news that we read about and see on the television every single day. We wonder when it's going to end. And so, very naturally, we come to places called church to escape the world. We sit in this beautiful nave, surrounded by beautiful people, hearing beautiful music, and we look out the window to that world, that place that's not in here. The problem with that, though, is as disciples of Jesus, those who follow Jesus, we are called not to escape and avoid the world. In fact, we are called to stand in the breach, in the midst of pain and suffering and violence and confusion and emptiness and brokenheartedness. As disciples of Jesus, we are called to be in those very places. How do we engage the world? How do we live in the world when there is so much bad news and awful things going on in the world? How do we live together? How do we live together when you disagree with your neighbor? Maybe you disagree with the person you're sitting next to right now. How do we live together in this world? How do we treat one another? How do we treat the person who is different than you are? Looks different, speaks a different language. How do you treat them? There is a very sophisticated word for this. How we treat and live with other people. It's a very sophisticated word, but you all are smart. I think you've heard this word before. It's called politics. And we are getting our fair dose of this lately. Politics, it's not a bad word. It's not a bad word. Politics is simply trying to figure out how people who are different than one another, how do we live together? How do we treat each other? Where are my rights relative to yours? That's what politics is trying to figure out. And so this morning you are hearing a political sermon. Now, I know this immediately makes some of you wiggle and uncomfortable, but it is a political sermon. I do want to be very clear. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. Number one, I would not do that, use this pulpit in that way. I would not do that for my own conscience. Secondly, I would get in a whole heap of trouble from the Internal Revenue Service if I were to tell you who to vote for. I know a rector of a very large Episcopal church who has had to deal with 6 years of lawsuits with the IRS because a guest preacher, in fact, told the congregation who to vote for. So I'm not doing that. Funny, when we go to dinner parties, we remind our spouse or significant other, or the person we're going with, we say, now, be sure not to talk about religion and politics. Yet we do, constantly. Funny how that works out. How do we live together and treat one another in this world? Isaiah, the prophet, 800 years before Jesus ever came along, Isaiah spoke a lot about politics in the midst of the temple. He stood outside the king's window. He stood in the midst of the temple. And like all prophets throughout the ages, he brought to light the behavior of the people who would go to the temple on a regular basis, week after week. They would dress in the best they had. They would enter God's sanctuary, and they would offer sacrifices of animals, bulls, goats, lambs. Because to offer a sacrifice in that day and time would mean that you would give your most prized possession, what was important, what cost a lot, what in fact gave you life. You would take that, bring it to the temple, and with one hand you would get the blood of that animal as a way to show your reverence of God, the Creator. And Isaiah said, it's very interesting. You come in and do this, and you have that blood of sacrifice on your hand, and yet there's blood on your other hand, because the other 6 days between visits to the temple, you don't treat the orphans and the widows very well. The women who were on the lowest rung of society, you are not treating them very well. Those who are poor, those who are oppressed. You don't seek justice. Yet you come into the temple and declare how wonderful God is and how wonderful your life is and all your blessings, only to leave with another type of blood on your hand. That's the context of what Isaiah is preaching about this morning. Think about that context. For what you could do is you could read this from Isaiah very literally, and I had a parishioner years ago who did this, because in Isaiah's preaching, he says, God declares God hates incense. Now, that's not to be taken literally, by the way. Think about the context of worship and why we're here and what the purpose of this is. We are, as Christian folks, as disciples of Jesus, we come here to worship. That is the chief thing we do as Christians. We come to offer our prayers to God, to sing our praises to God. We come to pray for that which we are confused. We come to pray for loved ones who are sick or loved ones who have died. We're confused in this confusing world that we live in, with so much violence and anger. And so we come and we offer to God a simple question: what do we do? Show us wisdom. God, direct our lives. That is the most important thing we come and do. And because we are fed in worship, we then go out into the world to help feed other people. That's the call and response, the call to worship, and then in gratitude for all we have, we offer ourselves to a world that needs peace and healing and wholeness. And Isaiah says, what can happen is sometimes we go into the temple to offer our sacrifices, our praises, and then the other 6 days of the week, we don't really care much for justice for others. And the way Isaiah writes this in the Hebrew, He says, this makes God nauseous. This makes God want to throw up. Is there a disconnect between what we do here on Sunday mornings and the other 6 days a week, when people in the world are crying out for all sorts of justice? One of the wonderful things about my vacation, it was long enough that I missed both political conventions. And I intentionally say both. I'm not pointing a finger on either side. It was wonderful. I missed a lot of the vitriol, the anger, the finger pointing that goes on in social media. It was wonderful to not see that for weeks. I can't tell you who to vote for, but I can tell you, because I believe it is my duty to join the chorus of prophets throughout the years, with Isaiah, all the prophets of the Old Testament, even with Jesus, to say, please pause and think about how you live in this world in ways that you are trying to make it a more just and right world for the people who live here, your neighbors, your friends, your co-workers, the stranger you pass on the street. How are we, you and I, what are we doing? How much are we doing to make this a more just world for those who are oppressed, those who are on the bottom rung of the ladder, those that we overlook, those that we trample over, those that we don't even consider? Back in the day, there was something called the social gospel. Perhaps you grew up in a church, very prevalent in the Deep South years ago. The social gospel, those preachers simply said the social gospel means you as a Christian are called to action. Faith and action go together. You can't just come and sit down in church and say, I believe in Jesus, and it not affect your life in any way to help better the lives of other people, to better your own life. That the gospel of Jesus, the words of the prophets for centuries, calling for a just world, that is serious work. It's what we're called to. It's just not words to be read aloud in church. Glenn Beck, a notable commentator of our culture, suggested a number of years ago that if you were ever to go to a church in which you heard the church demand justice for people, to demand social justice, to demand economic justice, if you were to see that written on a church's website, if you were to hear that from a pulpit, Glenn Beck's advice to you was leave that church. Run from that church. Out of all due respect, I don't know Glenn Beck. I've never met him. I've rarely listened to him. I've never read anything he's written other than this. There has long been this debate in the church between the social gospel and the salvation of souls. For there are some Christians and some churches and preachers who say, what happens in this world really is not important. The most important thing is for you to get saved and for your soul to go to heaven. That's more important. And this stuff here on earth, well, the earth is going to disappear. You're going to die. It's not quite so important. And those on the social gospel side would say, yes, life in God's kingdom is important. The healing and salvation of all of our souls is important. But God's kingdom is not some future event in some future place. Jesus invited people to God's kingdom here and now. And so what does that kingdom look like? That kingdom of justice and righteousness, what does that look like? What makes a worship acceptable to God is not necessarily what we do here this morning, but the mission we pursue in the world. Glenn Beck called for those who go to churches that insist on making the gospel active, making the gospel have feet and to make a difference and to change the world. Glenn Beck called on those people to leave. I'm not sure what Bible Glenn Beck reads, but I know it doesn't include the prophet Isaiah.